She never knew her billionaire husband wasn't human until she saw the creature. She married from a mirror. They say mirrors never lie. They reveal what the eyes refuse to see, what the heart tries desperately to deny. And on a cold October night, when rain hammered against the windows of a mansion worth $40 million, a woman named Rebecca lifted an antique mirror with trembling hands. What she saw in that reflection would shatter everything she thought she knew about the man sleeping beside her for 3 years. In the mirror where her husband's face should have been, she saw something else, something ancient, something that had been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for the moment she would finally look close enough to see the truth. But how does a woman marry a creature and not know it? How does she share a bed, share her life, share her body with something that was never human to begin with? This is the story of Rebecca Chen, a woman who thought she had found her fairy tale ending, only to discover she had been living in a nightmare dressed in expensive suits and billion-dollar smiles. And by the time she understood what she had married, it might have been too late to escape. Because some secrets once revealed change everything. And some creatures don't let their prey simply walk away. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Marcus Thornton really? The tech billionaire who appeared from nowhere 5 years ago, building an empire so quickly that Forbes called it impossible. The man with no childhood friends, no family photos, no past that anyone could verify. The husband who never aged, whose skin stayed cold even in summer, whose eyes seemed to shift color when the lights went low. Rebecca had noticed these things, of course, little details that nagged at the edges of her awareness, like whispers she couldn't quite hear. But love has a way of quieting those whispers, doesn't it? Of convincing us that what we're seeing can't possibly be real. Why did Marcus cover every mirror in their home with cloth? Why did he disappear every full moon, returning at dawn with mud on his shoes and a smell like river water clinging to his clothes? And why, when Rebecca asked about his family, did his expression go blank? As if he were trying to remember lines from a script he'd forgotten? These questions haunted her for months, but she pushed them down, buried them beneath the life they were building together. Because sometimes we choose not to see what's right in front of us. Sometimes we choose the beautiful lie over the ugly truth. But the truth has a way of revealing itself whether we're ready for it or not. Rebecca Chen grew up in a small apartment in Seattle, raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident when she was 7 years old. Her grandmother was a woman who believed in old stories, in spirits that walked among us wearing human faces, in warnings passed down through generations that most people dismissed as superstition. She would tell young Rebecca about creatures that fed on human love, that took human form to walk in our world, that married unsuspecting women and slowly drained them of their life force. Rebecca would listen, half believing, half amused, never imagining those stories would one day become her reality. She moved through life quietly, working as a nurse at Seattle General Hospital, caring for others because it was the only thing that made her feel whole after losing so much. She wasn't looking for wealth or fame. She just wanted someone to love, someone who would see her for who she really was, someone who would stay. And then, on a rainy March evening when she was walking home from a double shift, exhausted and soaked to the bone, she met Marcus Thornton. He was standing under an awning outside a closed bookstore, perfectly dry despite the downpour. Watching her with eyes that seemed to glow in the streetlight, he offered her his umbrella. She hesitated, but something about his smile made her trust him, made her forget every warning her grandmother had ever given her about strangers with too perfect smiles. They talked for hours that night, sitting in an all-night diner where the coffee was terrible, but the conversation felt like coming home. Marcus told her he was an entrepreneur, that he'd recently moved to Seattle to start a new company. He didn't mention that his company would be valued at $3 billion within 2 years. He didn't mention that he had no social security number, no birth certificate, no records of existence before 5 years ago. He just listened to her talk about her grandmother, her work at the hospital, her dreams of traveling to places she'd only seen in pictures. And when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she'd never experienced before. Seen and wanted and chosen. It felt like fate. It felt like the universe finally giving her the happiness she deserved after so much loss. But there were moments, even then, when something felt off. When his hand touched hers and his skin felt too smooth, too cold, like touching marble. When his reflection in the diner window seemed to flicker, just for a second, showing something else beneath the handsome face. When he ordered coffee but never actually drank it, just held the cup and watched her with an intensity that made her shiver. She ignored these moments. She told herself she was being paranoid, that her grandmother's stories had planted seeds of doubt where none should exist. She told herself that Marcus was just different, that his intensity was passion, that his coldness was just poor circulation. We believe what we want to believe, don't we? We ignore the warnings because the alternative is too frightening to consider. 6 months later, Marcus proposed, not with a grand gesture or a public display, but privately in the apartment they now shared, with a ring that looked like it belonged in a museum, ancient and beautiful and somehow wrong. Rebecca said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down her face, thinking this was the beginning of her happily ever after. She didn't notice how Marcus's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. She didn't notice how the ring seemed to tighten on her finger, as if it were alive. She didn't notice that from the moment she put it on, she began having dreams of water and scales and eyes that watched her from the depths of dark rivers. She just felt grateful. Grateful that someone like Marcus, someone successful and handsome and attentive, would choose someone like her. But gratitude can blind us. Gratitude can make us accept things we should question. And by the time Rebecca started questioning, she was already bound to something she didn't understand. The wedding happened quickly, too quickly, in a private ceremony at the mansion Marcus had bought for them, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Seattle that backed onto a forest so dense you couldn't see through the trees. There were no guests. Marcus said he preferred intimacy, that he had no family to invite, that he wanted this day to be just about them. The officiant was an older man who spoke in a language Rebecca didn't recognize, performing rituals that felt more ancient than traditional. And strangest of all, every mirror in the mansion was covered with white silk cloth. When Rebecca asked why, Marcus simply smiled and said mirrors brought bad luck on wedding days. She accepted this explanation, even though something in his voice suggested he was lying, even though every instinct screamed that something was deeply wrong. On their wedding night, as they stood in the master bedroom, Rebecca caught a glimpse of something in the silver frame of a photograph on the dresser. Just a flash, just a second, but enough to make her blood run cold. In the reflection, Marcus's shadow wasn't human. It was longer, serpentine, moving in ways that didn't match his body. She blinked and it was gone. She convinced herself it was the champagne, the exhaustion, the overwhelming emotion of the day. But that night, when Marcus kissed her, his tongue felt forked against hers. And when he held her, his embrace felt less like love and more like constriction, like something coiling around her, holding her in place. She fell asleep in his arms, but her dreams were filled with water and darkness and the sensation of drowning. The months that followed were strange. Marcus would disappear at night, claiming he had business calls with investors in different time zones, returning at dawn smelling like earth and rain. He never ate in front of her, always finding excuses to skip meals or claiming he'd already eaten. His body temperature remained unnaturally cold, and when she mentioned it, he laughed it off as poor circulation. But Rebecca was a nurse. She knew what poor circulation looked like, and this wasn't it. This was something else entirely. She began to notice other things too. How servants in the house avoided certain hallways. How the mansion had an entire wing that Marcus kept locked, claiming it was under renovation. How animals, even birds, wouldn't come near the property. How her own reflection in windows sometimes showed her looking older, more tired, as if something was slowly draining the life from her. She tried to talk to Marcus about her concerns, but he had a way of making her feel foolish, of twisting her words until she doubted her own perceptions. He would hold her close and whisper that she was stressed, that she was adjusting to a new life, that her imagination was running wild, and she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her unease was just paranoia, that the life she'd built with him was real and good and safe. But then came the night she saw the photographs. She'd been looking for paperwork in Marcus's study, searching for insurance documents after a minor car accident, when she found a locked drawer. The key was hidden under a paperweight, almost as if he wanted her to find it. Inside were photographs of women, dozens of them, all beautiful, all wearing the same ring Rebecca now wore. And written on the back of each photo was a date in a single word: completed. Rebecca's hands shook as she shuffled through the images. Some of the photographs were old, sepia-toned, from eras long past. Others were more recent, in color, showing women in modern dress. But they all had the same look in their eyes, a look of exhaustion, of emptiness, as if something vital had been taken from them. And in the very back of the drawer, she found a leather journal. The handwriting inside was elegant, old-fashioned, and as she read, her heart began to race. It was a record, a log of names and dates spanning over 200 years. And at the very end, in fresh ink, was her own name, Rebecca Chen, written months before they'd ever met, before she'd ever walked down that rainy street and encountered the man who would become her husband. He had known her name before she knew his. He had chosen her, marked her, and she had walked right into his trap. That night when Marcus came home, Rebecca confronted him. She held up the photographs in the journal, her voice shaking but determined. "Who are these women, Marcus? What is this? Who are you really?" For a long moment, Marcus just stood there, perfectly still, his eyes reflecting the lamplight in a way that made them look inhuman. Then he smiled, but it wasn't the smile she'd fallen in love with. It was something else, something cold and ancient and utterly without mercy. He spoke softly, almost gently, as if explaining something to a child. "Some truths, Rebecca, your heart is not ready for. Some things are better left unknown. Walk away from this. Forget what you've seen, and we can continue our life together as if nothing happened." But Rebecca couldn't forget, wouldn't forget. And that's when everything changed. That's when Marcus stopped pretending. And that's when Rebecca realized that the man she'd married had never been a man at all. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching," and let us know what you think Rebecca should do. Would you have confronted him, or would you have run? Rebecca didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. She lay in bed next to Marcus, feeling his cold body beside her, listening to his breathing, which sounded less like breathing and more like air, moving through something hollow. She waited until she was certain he was asleep. Then she slipped out of bed and began to search the mansion. She needed answers. She needed to understand what she had gotten herself into and how she could possibly get out. The locked wing of the house called to her, and she remembered seeing Marcus hide a key in his study. She retrieved it with shaking hands, her heart pounding so loud she was certain it would wake him. But Marcus remained still, too still, like a statue rather than a sleeping man. The locked wing was cold, far colder than the rest of the house. And as Rebecca pushed open the heavy door, she was hit with a smell that made her stomach turn. It was the smell of damp earth and stagnant water, and something else, something organic and decaying. The hallway beyond was lit by old sconces that flickered with a light that seemed more blue than yellow. The walls were covered in carvings, ancient symbols that hurt to look at, that seemed to writhe and shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. She walked slowly, terrified of what she might find, but more terrified of not knowing. Because ignorance, she was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous thing of all. Ignorance is what had allowed Marcus to trap her. Knowledge, even terrible knowledge, was the only thing that might set her free. At the end of the hallway was a room, and inside that room was a pool of dark water. Not a swimming pool, but something older, something that looked like it had been there long before the mansion was built. The water was perfectly still, black as ink, reflecting nothing. And around the pool were more photographs, hundreds of them, covering every wall, all women, all wearing that same ring. Rebecca approached the nearest photograph and looked closely at the woman's face. She looked familiar somehow, and then Rebecca realized why. The woman had her eyes, her exact eyes. She looked at another photograph. This woman had her nose, another, her mouth. It was as if Marcus had been collecting pieces, finding women who each had one feature he wanted, taking from them until he found someone who had everything. And Rebecca, she realized with growing horror, was the complete package. She had everything he'd been searching for across centuries. And that's why he'd marked her name in his journal before they'd ever met. Because he'd been watching her, studying her, waiting for the right moment to make her his. She heard a sound behind her and spun around. Marcus stood in the doorway, no longer bothering to hide what he was. His eyes glowed golden in the darkness, and his shadow stretched impossibly long behind him, writhing and coiling like a living thing. His voice when he spoke had changed. It was deeper, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. You were not supposed to find this place, Rebecca. Not yet. Not until the binding was complete. Rebecca backed away, her mind racing. The binding? What binding? Marcus smiled, and she saw his teeth were too sharp. Too many. The ring, my dear. The ring binds you to me. With each day you wear it, more of your life force becomes mine. In 3 more months, the process would have been complete. You would have given me everything, willingly, lovingly, and I would have become more human than I've been in 200 years. But now you've ruined it by asking questions. Now we have to do this the hard way. He moved toward her, not walking but gliding, and Rebecca did the only thing she could think of. She ran. She ran back through the hallway, through the mansion, her bare feet slapping against marble floors, Marcus's laughter echoing behind her. But no matter how fast she ran, she could feel him right behind her, could feel his presence like cold water closing over her head. She burst out the front door and into the forest, branches tearing at her outfit, her breath coming in gasps. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away, had to find help, had to survive long enough to figure out how to break whatever curse he'd put on her. Because the ring was still on her finger, and no matter how hard she pulled, it wouldn't come off. It had fused to her skin, becoming part of her, binding her to the creature that called himself Marcus Thornton. She ran until she couldn't run anymore, collapsing against a tree, her lungs burning. The forest was silent around her, too silent, as if every living thing had fled from what was coming. And then she heard it, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Not footsteps, something else, something sliding, serpentine, ancient. She looked back and saw him, but he wasn't wearing Marcus's face anymore. He was wearing his true form, the form he'd hidden for so long, and it was beautiful and terrible all at once. A creature of scales and shadow, human enough to be recognizable but alien enough to be nightmare. He spoke to her, and his voice was almost sad. Did you really think you could run from me, Rebecca? You are bound to me. Your life is mine now. It has been mine since the moment you put on that ring. But perhaps I can be merciful. Come back to the house. Accept what you are now. And I promise I will make your ending gentle. It doesn't have to hurt. It can feel like falling asleep, like slipping into warm water, like love. Rebecca's mind raced. Her grandmother's stories came back to her. Fragments of old wisdom she'd thought were just fairy tales. And then she remembered something. A story about a woman who escaped a serpent spirit by using its own reflection against it. Mirrors, her grandmother had said, show the truth that creatures like this try to hide. They reveal the soul beneath the skin. And if you can make them see themselves, truly see themselves, their power breaks. Rebecca didn't know if it was true. She didn't know if any of the old stories were true, but she knew she had to try, because the alternative was giving up, becoming another photograph on his wall, another name in his journal. And Rebecca Chen had survived too much in her life to go down without a fight. So she stood up, looked the creature in its glowing eyes, and spoke the words she'd heard her grandmother say 1,000 times. Words in a language older than English. Words that tasted like iron and starlight on her tongue. And the creature that had been Marcus Thornton stopped moving. And for the first time it looked afraid. What happened next would change everything Rebecca thought she understood about the creature she'd married. The words she'd spoken, the old language her grandmother had taught her, hung in the air between them like a challenge. The creature, still in its serpentine form, coiled back, its golden eyes widening in what looked like genuine shock. How do you know those words? It hissed, its voice no longer layered but singular, almost vulnerable. Those words have not been spoken in this world for over 3 centuries. Who taught you the old tongue? Rebecca felt power in that moment, power she hadn't known she possessed. Her grandmother's stories weren't just entertainment, they were protection, they were weapons. And somehow, her grandmother had known, had prepared her for this moment without Rebecca ever realizing it. She didn't answer his question. Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She walked back toward the mansion, toward the locked wing, toward the room with the pool of black water. The creature followed her, confused, cautious, no longer the predator, but something else, something uncertain. When they reached the room, Rebecca searched through the covered furniture until she found what she was looking for. A full-length mirror, ancient and ornate, hidden beneath a sheet. She pulled the sheet away and dragged the mirror to the edge of the pool, positioning it so that it reflected both her and the creature. "Look at yourself," she commanded, her voice stronger than she felt. "Look at what you really are, not what you pretend to be. Not the beautiful lie you wear to seduce and destroy. Look at the truth." The creature resisted at first, turning its head away, its whole body trembling. "No," it whispered, "I cannot. If I look, if I truly see myself, the binding breaks. The spell that keeps me tethered to this world dissolves. I will cease to exist in this form. I will return to what I was before I learned to walk among humans, before I learned to love them." Rebecca's hand went to the ring on her finger, and she felt it loosening, responding to the creature's fear. "Then look," she said quietly, "because I need to understand. I need to know why. Why me? Why all those women? What are you really searching for?" The creature, still in its serpentine form, slowly turned its head toward the mirror. And what Rebecca saw in that reflection changed everything she thought she knew about the monster she'd married. In the mirror, the creature wasn't a monster. It was a man, a real man, human and vulnerable, with tears streaming down his face. But the reflection showed more than just his appearance. It showed his truth, his history, his pain. Rebecca saw visions in the mirror, flickering like old film, showing her the creature's origin. He had been human once, centuries ago. A man named Emmanuel who had been wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit. He'd been hunted by a mob, chased into a river, where he drowned calling out for someone to save him, for someone to see his innocence. But no one came. No one saved him. And in his dying moments, he'd made a deal with something ancient that lived in that river. He'd traded his humanity for survival, his soul for revenge. And he'd lived for 200 years, trapped between forms, neither fully human nor fully spirit, searching desperately for a way to become whole again. The women, Rebecca realized as she watched the visions unfold, weren't victims in the way she'd thought. They were attempts, failed attempts to become human again. Each woman he married represented a piece of humanity he was trying to reclaim. Love, trust, connection. But it never worked because he was taking instead of giving, consuming instead of sharing. With each failed attempt, he became more desperate, more monstrous, more convinced that he was beyond redemption. Until he found Rebecca. She was different, the mirror showed her, because she had something the others didn't. She had been touched by death herself when her parents died, had lived on the border between life and grief, and that gave her a kind of power. The power to see truth, the power to break curses, the power to choose whether this creature remained a monster or became a man again. The creature, seeing itself in the mirror, seeing its own truth reflected back, let out a sound that was part sob, part howl. "I didn't want to be this," it said, and its voice was fully human now, raw with centuries of anguish. "I just wanted to be seen, to be loved, to be human again. But every time I tried, I took too much. I couldn't help it. The hunger was too strong. And then I met you, Rebecca. You with your grandmother's wisdom and your nurse's compassion and your survivor's strength. You were supposed to be different. You were supposed to save me. But instead, I was going to destroy you, just like I destroyed all the others." The realization seemed to break something in him, and he began to change, to shift. his serpentine form dissolving. "Marcus," Rebecca said quietly, using his chosen name for the first time since she'd discovered the truth. "That's not your real name, is it?" The creature looked at her with human eyes now, eyes full of pain and regret. "No," he whispered. "My real name is Emmanuel, and I have been lost for so very long." Rebecca stood at a crossroads in that moment. She could run. She could take off the ring, now that it was loosening, and escape while he was weak and vulnerable. She could leave him to whatever fate-awaited creatures that broke the rules of their existence. That's what any sane person would do. That's what survival demanded. But Rebecca had spent her whole life caring for broken things. She'd become a nurse because she believed in healing, in second chances, in the possibility of redemption. And as she looked at Emmanuel, no longer wearing the mask of Marcus Thornton, no longer hiding behind illusion and manipulation, she saw something in him that gave her pause. She saw herself, lost, lonely, desperate to be seen and loved and chosen. And she made a decision that would either save them both or destroy her completely. She reached out her hand, not to strike him, not to push him away, but to offer him what no one else had in 200 years, a choice and a chance. What Rebecca offered Emmanuel wasn't blind forgiveness. It wasn't naive acceptance of what he'd done to the women before her. It was something more powerful and more difficult. She offered him accountability, truth, and the possibility of change. She sat with him in that room, the mirror between them, and she made him look at every photograph on the walls, made him speak the name of every woman he'd taken from, made him acknowledge the weight of what he'd done, not to punish him, but to make him truly see the cost of his survival. Because monsters aren't born, she told him. They're created by choices, by fear, by taking the easy path instead of the hard one. You chose to take instead of asking, to consume instead of connecting. And that's what made you a monster, not the curse. The curse just gave you the power to act on your worst impulses. Emmanuel wept as he looked at the photographs, as he spoke names he'd tried to forget. Clara, Margaret, Yuki, Amara, Maria, dozens of names spanning centuries. Each one a woman who'd trusted him, who'd loved him, who'd given him everything only to be drained of their life force and discarded. The photographs showed their progression, beautiful and vibrant at first, then gradually fading, aging rapidly, becoming hollow versions of themselves before disappearing entirely. "What happened to them after?" Rebecca asked quietly. Emmanuel's voice was barely a whisper. "They lived, most of them, but they were changed, emptied. Some went mad. Others simply faded from the world, unable to remember who they'd been before me. I told myself they were sacrifices for a greater purpose, that my suffering justified their pain. But looking at them now, seeing what I took, I realized I was just afraid. Afraid of being alone, afraid of remaining a monster forever. So I created more victims to avoid facing my own truth." Rebecca felt something shift inside her as she listened. Anger, yes. Horror at what he'd done. But also something unexpected. Understanding. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever for some of what he'd done. But understanding that pain, when left unhealed, creates monsters. That loneliness can drive us to terrible choices. That the line between victim and perpetrator is sometimes thinner than we want to believe. She thought of her grandmother, who had survived her own traumas, who had turned her pain into wisdom and protection for the next generation. And she realized that this was her choice now. She could become another name in Emmanuel's journal, another cautionary tale. Or she could break the cycle entirely, not by running, but by changing the terms, by refusing to be either victim or savior, and instead being something else entirely, a witness, a truth teller, and possibly, if he was willing to do the work, a guide back to his lost humanity. She made him a deal. The ring would come off, releasing the binding. She would be free to leave, to go back to her life, to report him to authorities if she chose. But in exchange, he would do something he'd never done before. He would face the consequences of his actions. He would find the women he'd damaged, the ones still living, and he would make amends. Not with money, though his wealth would help, but with truth, with acknowledgement, with the resources to heal from what he'd taken from them. And he would learn to live as Emmanuel again, not as Marcus, not hiding behind illusion and wealth, but as a man trying to atone for 200 years of harm. "It won't make you human," Rebecca told him, as the ring finally slipped from her finger, leaving a faint scar. "That's not how curses work, but it might make you worthy of humanity. It might give you the one thing you've been searching for all this time. Not love, but integrity. Not comfort, but peace." Emmanuel agreed. Not because he believed it would work, but because for the first time in centuries, someone had seen his truth and hadn't run away screaming. Someone had held up a mirror to his soul and said, "You can choose differently." And that small act of faith, that tiny seed of hope, was more powerful than any curse. Over the following months, Rebecca didn't stay with Emmanuel. She moved out of the mansion, returned to her work at the hospital, rebuilt her life on her own terms. But she didn't disappear from his life entirely. She became, in an unexpected way, his conscience. His reminder that change was possible but never easy, that atonement was measured not in grand gestures, but in daily choices, in the hard work of facing who you've been and deciding who you want to become. She watched from a distance as he reached out to the women he'd harmed, offering them not excuses but resources, therapy, financial support, acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. Some accepted. Others told him to never contact them again. He accepted both responses with equal grace, understanding that he had no right to their forgiveness, only to his own efforts at change. And slowly something remarkable happened. Emmanuel began to age, not rapidly, not like the women he'd drained, but naturally. He found his first gray hair 6 months after Rebecca left. He developed laugh lines around his eyes. His skin grew warmer. He wasn't becoming human because of magic or curses breaking. He was becoming human because he was finally learning what humanity actually meant. It meant accountability, vulnerability, living with the weight of your choices and choosing every single day to do better, to be better. And 1 year later, when Rebecca received a letter from him, written in that same elegant handwriting from the journal, but filled with words of genuine change and humble hope, she cried. Not because she had saved him, but because he had finally learned to save himself. And in doing so, he'd released her from the burden of being his redemption. She was free, truly free. And so, in his own way, was he. Rebecca never returned to Emmanuel, not in the way you might expect from a love story. This isn't that kind of tale. She didn't marry him again. She didn't stay to watch over him or ensure his transformation was complete. Because Rebecca understood something that takes many of us a lifetime to learn. You cannot heal someone else's wounds. You cannot break someone else's curse. You can offer truth. You can hold up a mirror. You can refuse to participate in their destruction. But the actual work of change, the real transformation from monster to human, from taker to giver, from fear to love, that's something only they can do. And Rebecca had her own healing to attend to. Her own scars from trusting too quickly, from ignoring warning signs, from believing that love alone could solve everything. She carried those lessons forward, not as bitterness, but as wisdom, and she lived. The last thing Rebecca heard about Emmanuel was 3 years later, through a mutual connection. He had sold the mansion and donated most of his wealth to organizations supporting survivors of domestic abuse and coercive relationships. He was living simply, working as a counselor for others, struggling with questions of identity and transformation. He had aged another decade in those 3 years, but those who met him said he seemed more alive than people half his age, more present, more human. The serpent spirit was gone, not because the curse had been magically lifted, but because Emmanuel had finally learned to stop feeding it, to stop taking, to stop hiding, and in choosing accountability over comfort, truth over illusion, he had become what he'd been searching for all along. Not a monster wearing human skin, but a human being, flawed and finite, and finally free. So now we turn to you watching this story unfold. What would you have done in Rebecca's place? Would you have run the moment you saw the photographs? Protecting yourself at all costs? Would you have stayed and tried to fix him, believing your love could heal centuries of damage? Or would you have done what Rebecca did, offering truth without sacrificing yourself, holding up the mirror, and then walking away to let him choose his own path? There's no right answer. Every one of us has our own boundaries, our own capacity for compassion, our own understanding of when to stay and when to go. But this story asks us to consider something important. How do we respond when we discover that the people we love are not who we thought they were? When the person sharing our bed has secrets that could destroy us? When the fairy tale reveals itself to be something darker and more complex than we imagine? And perhaps even more important, this story asks us to think about ourselves, about the ways we might be hiding our own truth, the ways we might be taking from others without realizing it, the ways we might be wearing masks so convincing that we've forgotten our own faces underneath, because we all have a choice every single day, to live in denial or truth, to take or to give, to hide behind illusion or step into authenticity, no matter how terrifying that might be. Emmanuel was a monster for 200 years, but he was also ultimately a man who chose to change. And that choice, that moment of looking in the mirror and finally seeing himself clearly, that's available to all of us, not because we're cursed, but because we're human. And being human means having the capacity for both great harm and great healing. The question is, which one will we choose? If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships and choices, we want to hear from you. Comment below and tell us, what would you have done in Rebecca's position? Would you have offered Emmanuel a chance at redemption, or would you have run and never looked back? And have you ever discovered that someone you loved was not who you thought they were? How did you handle it? We read every comment, and your stories matter to us. They remind us that we're all navigating these complex questions together. And if you're new here, subscribe to our channel so you never miss these stories that touch the heart, challenge the mind, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Because next week, we have another tale for you. One about a woman who discovered that her reflection in the mirror was not her own, and what she found on the other side changed everything she thought she knew about reality itself. Until then, remember, mirrors don't lie. They show us the truth we're often too afraid to see. The question is, are we brave enough to look?